and we'll begin. Give it a minute or two to give folks time to join us. All right. Okay, good evening. Welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica with Greenlight, and we are thrilled, like super nerding out, to host tonight's pre-launch event with Douglas Wolk for his new book, All of the Marvels, A Journey to the Ends of the Biggest Story Ever Told. He's going to be talking tonight with Evan Narcisse, so you are in excellent hands. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Douglas, to Evan, and to the team at Penguin for making this event happen, and to all of you for showing up. Although we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Couple little housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first one is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees, maybe share your fan theories. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And very importantly, tonight's featured book, All of the Marvels, is available for pre-order from Greenlight Bookstore. The book hits our shelves on October 12th, but you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for future pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. You can buy it now while you're thinking of it and have it in hand or in the mail next Tuesday. So I'll drop the buy link in the chat in a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Okay, some introductions. Our interviewer tonight is Evan Narcisse. Evan is a writer and consultant who works in video games, comic books, and TV, often focusing on the intersection of Blackness and pop culture. He was a journalist and critic for many years, and he's taught a course on video game journalism at NYU and appeared as an expert guest on CNN and NPR. He's the author of The Rise of the Black Panther graphic novel for Marvel Comics, which he presented at Greenlight back in 2018, and works in the video game industry as a narrative design consultant. Though he now lives in Austin, Texas, Evan is a native New Yorker, and I will never get tired of bragging about the fact that back in the day, he and I co-hosted an ongoing graphic novel book group at McNally Jackson Bookstore. So it's a special treat tonight to have him back to talk comics with us. Evan is going to be speaking with our featured author, Douglas Wolk. He's a comics writer, critic, journalist, and teacher, as well as the author previously of the Eisner Award-winning book Reading Comics, and host of the podcast, The Voice of Latveria. A National Arts Journalism Program fellow, Wolk has written about comic books, graphic novels, pop music, and technology for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, The Believer, Slate, and Pitchfork, and he lives in Portland, Oregon. His brand new book, All of the Marvels, is the first ever full reckoning with Marvel Comics' interconnected 500,000-page story, a revelatory guide to the epic of epics and to the past 60 years of American culture, from a beloved authority on the subject who read all 27,000 plus Marvel superhero comics and lived to tell the tale. Jonathan Lethem describes Wolk's, quote, naked dive into the Marvel source code as a tour both electrifying in its weird charisma and replenishing in its loving specificity. So you're in for something really special tonight. Douglas is going to start us off with a slideshow to give us a taste of what we're in for with this book, and then he's going to be talking with Evan and with all of you. So Douglas, please take it away.
Wow, thank you so much. Let's see if we can make this work. Play slideshow. Great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk for like 5 or 6 minutes about a particular visual trope involving Spider-Man that has shown up a lot over the years, Spider-Man and the gigantic heavy thing. Now, the way that this has probably been seen more than any other is in 27 Spider-Man Homecoming. There's a scene near the end where Spider-Man has just had like a giant mass of stuff collapse on him, and he's trying to lift it up, and he's going, "Come on, Spider-Man, come on, Spider-Man." That is a callback to an image that we have seen over and over. We first see it in 1966 in this issue, The Amazing Spider-Man 33. Steve Ditko plotted it and drew it. Stan Lee added dialogue, and it is a scene where he's been trapped under this. Look at this specific machine that he's under. He's trapped under this piece of machinery. It's much too heavy for him to lift. He's thinking about all the people who are depending on him. You can see what's going on in this sequence just from looking at the pictures without the words at all. Some of the words are kind of nice. Stanley, within my body is the strength of many men and all that. But it is him summoning the strength to do what he has to do and eventually freeing himself. And that is kind of a quintessential Spider-Man moment. He is this kid who has been put in a situation that is much too hard and much too big for him and pushes his way out of it anyway. So this is at the beginning of 1966. The first time that you start seeing visual homages to it, the earliest one I've seen is this one from 1979. This is a freebie comic that was given away with the Columbus Dispatch, where clearly the artists aren't credited. Mike B, Sal Buscema, and Mike Esposito, but they're calling back to this comic from 1966. Then a little next year, there's a Hulk story by Doug Mensch and Ron Wilson, where it's the same gizmo, it's the same machine he's under. And again, this is a homage to this. This was in a magazine size thing that was not sold with the comic books. It was a little pricier. It was sold on the magazine racks. In 1982, Gil Kane, who was an artist who had been working in the comics since the early 1940s, gave an interview about how classic this particular moment was for him as an example of Steve Ditko's work. And there's a couple of DC stories where you can see here he used the same sort of idea. He called back to that. Walt Simonson, when he was doing Thor in the mid-80s, does a sequence where Thor is a frog for complicated reasons. And he's once again restaging this Ditko sequence. He even uses a little bit of dialogue. Within my body is the strength of many frogs, says the Thor frog here. And then it starts to turn up more and more and more. In the early 90s, there's a spectacular Spider-Man sequence we see here. There's another Amazing Spider-Man sequence that pretty much restages it exactly the same way. A little later, Spectacular Spider-Man does it again, but this time somebody else comes in and rescues him. There's even a little bit of an issue of Love and Rockets from the mid-1990s where Jaime Hernandez is just drawing a dog hanging out under the giant heavy thing in the rain. Finally, by 1998, once again, we're seeing this, and it's been done so many times that you see Spider-Man thinking here, funny, I have the overwhelming sense of deja vu. And again, the early 2000s, J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr., once they do a direct sort of callback to it, once they do, like, let's just do the same kind of thing where he just has to lift something incredibly heavy, to the point where when Tom Brevoort wrote a Spider-Man manifesto for the forthcoming Spider-Man relaunch in 2006, he was like, yeah, let's no more lift the big heavy thing off his back. Let's just ease off on that. Like, let's make some new memorable moments. And still, you kept seeing it. So how did this start happening? Well, that original story was printed in 1966. It was not reprinted until 1970, when it showed up in an issue of Marvel Tales, which was reprinting all the Spider-Man stories. It was reprinted again there in 1985, which got it a little bit more into circulation. But at this point, when it was originally printed, when a comic went off sale, it was gone. Like, you couldn't find a copy unless you happened to find somebody you could swap with or something. There were a few mail order places that were selling comics. There's a little bit more of that by 1970. There's a bunch more by 1985. But where it really starts coming into circulation, 1987, in the Sears catalog, there's a book called The Best of Marvel Comics. It reprints that story. It reprints the first Black Panther story, too, from Fantastic Four. It reprints a few other stories, and it sells a gajillion copies because it's Sears, and it gets it into a lot of people's hands. A few years later, when Marvel starts doing the Marvel Masterworks books, it's reprinted, and now it's continuously in print. And people who want to see what 60s Spider-Man looked like can find it. And it starts getting into the canon. Around 2000, Marvel asks its readers, what are the greatest stories ever? And this is like number 15 or something, so it's reprinted there. And canons are self-reinforcing because the best stories ever are the best stories ever because everybody knows they're the best stories ever, so they're the best stories ever. So 7 years or so ago when Marvel pulled people again, what are our best stories ever? That one made it in there. It's in the 75th anniversary omnibus. And it starts turning up in other contexts as just like a thing that everybody knows is a Spider-Man image. Deadpool is making fun of him on the cover here. Deadpool is making fun of him again. You see, the grasshopper going, lifting is the only way. You see Venom collapsed under it here. There's a bit in the Miles Morales and Peter Parker team-up issue from a few years ago where they're talking about that particular story. And it even shows up near the beginning of the video game a couple years ago, Marvel Spider-Man. It's not quite the same scenario, but it's the same kind of pose. And it is a way for the people who made that game to say, we know who this character is. We know what the essence of this character is. Now you know too. I'm going to stop sharing here if I can, if it will let me stop sharing. It will not let me stop sharing. I will never stop sharing. There we go. And are we back to Zoom? Yes, we are. Excellent. Anyway, thank you. Hi, Evan.
Hi, Douglas. That was so great.
Thank you.
I mean, there were a couple of instances there I didn't know about. So, as always, being friends with you is so educational. I do want to start off by saying that Douglas is my homie. We're two guys who've written about comics, around comics, in comics for a long time. We wrote at similar outlets while we were lucky for them to exist. And I'm just so glad to, this is the first event, right? Inaugural event for all of the Marvels, right?
This is the inaugural event. It doesn't come out till next week. You can buy it through Greenlight bookstore. I believe they even have like signed book plates. And not only are they signed, but I wrote like a word balloon with like a little quote from one or another old Doctor Strange story in every one. So.
Yeah. So go out and get it if you guys can pre-order. I also want to start off by shouting out people in the attendees list. What's up, Steve? Steve used to be one of our attendees for the book club that Jessica and I used to host. Sean Howe's in the house, who's the author of Marvel Comics: The Untold Story, a great
amazing book.
Yeah,
amazing book.
Shout out to Sean. Shout out to Annie Nocenti.
Yes.
Sakpase Sherry. So glad to see you here. People who've been around Marvel, who've worked at Marvel, and we're just so glad to see you here. So, Douglas, I want to start off by talking about what seems to be the animating question of this whole endeavor, which is to ask, like, what do these stories mean in the real world? What does it mean to make them and read them and ask that they have meaning? Why does all that matter? Especially when so many of these comics were thought of as disposable, like you said, these comics will come out and then disappear. So what does it mean to kind of like look for deeper kind of metaphorical import in this whole publishing business that Marvel's been running for decades?
That's a really good question. I mean, the comics of any given moment, even if, and maybe even especially if they are disposable entertainment, are about their moment. They are made by their moment. They reflect the concerns of their moment in a way that might not be clear till much later. And if you look at them as a giant mass of all of these stories together, they kind of tell the story of what the last 60 years have been. They tell it in a weird, modulated, distorted, reflected way, but it's always there informing the stories, and it comes out of them.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things I did last year was co-host a podcast from Marvel called Declassified, and we talked about the publishing history of Marvel and, some of the real world events that inform the stories. So all in the classic kind of 1960s characters, so many of them are rooted in Cold War anxiety, right? Yeah. So you have the Hulk getting his, Bruce Banner's building a weapon, a new, an atomic weapon, a gamma bomb. And
he's building a gamma bomb right after the atomic weapons testing ban moratorium ended.
Right. So, yeah. And, it's so funny how, like, so many of these coincidences, I can call that a coincidence, but like, you have to wonder if the nuclear testing ban was on the mind of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and the people that they were working with. So talk to me about, like, what we can learn about the creators and their sensibilities by virtue of the work.
you can tell some things about the creators and their sensibilities. You can tell maybe even more about just what's around them, what the conversation is around them, because that's what you're interested in as a creator is going to feed into what you write and draw. And it's going to be what's on your mind. And sometimes that's in a really specific way, like, Steve Englehart doing basically a Symbionese Liberation Army story in Captain America in the early 70s. And sometimes it's in a much more general way. Like, you can see the progression from 1963 when Tony Stark can be introduced as a munitions manufacturer and we're all pretty rah-rah about him, to 1967-68 when Iron Man's visiting Vietnam and we're not totally sure how we feel about it, to a few years later when there are student protesters at the Stark plant and they kind of have a point, and then there's a very Kent State-like thing that happens and where 4 protesters are shot dead, and that's immediately walked back the next month like, oh yeah, they were injured, we thought they were dead for a little bit, they're fine. They're fine.
There's a story I've heard that I think might be apocryphal or not, but it was
Print the legend.
Yes. Let me get it out first. But it was Denny O'Neil, one of my heroes, wearing a peace button inside the Marvel offices, and Stanley like ripping it off of him. It's like, don't ever like show up with that on. And I think, it wasn't because that Stanley was a big hawk. I think it was more about like he was so careful about Marvel's positioning in the public consciousness with regard to like controversial issues that like he didn't want anybody in the editorial staff like openly advocating a political stance. So, the fact that this stuff wound up in the books anyway was, again, I think testament to this collective subconscious that kind of bubbles up through the comics. One of the other questions I want to ask you is like, do you feel like, aside from, the godfathers of the Marvel Universe, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, do you feel like there were specific points in the overarching Marvel story where one creator's voice rose above the rest or steered the collective effort in a particular way?
I don't know that there are moments where there's been one voice steering the conversation, in particular because so often the best things that have come out of Marvel have been collaborative things. I mean, there is a long period where Brian Michael Bendis is one of those voices and is very much directing things, but he's doing it in conjunction with a bunch of other people. There is a way where, Chris Claremont steers the X-Men for 15, 16 years, along with, Annie Nocenti, who's in the audience right now, and I can't get over that, and, Louise Simonson and other people who were working alongside him. But again, that's always collaborative, and that's part of the line. That's not everything. There's always, after the point where Leanne Kirby and Ditko no longer have their specific fingers in everything, there's a bunch of voices going on, and they're doing really different things at the same time. And I think that's really healthy. I also think it's lovely to see the way that even when the crossover stuff starts happening in earnest, 2005, 2006, it's never just one person saying, okay, this is how it's going to be. It's a bunch of writers talking to each other, and a bunch of writers and editors and artists all kind of pushing things in their own way and feeding off of each other.
Do you feel like there was a cohesion lost as the core of comics creators kind of performed exodus outside of New York? I feel like, one thing that is so amazing about the comics of like the 60s through the 80s is, most of these creators live in New York City, and whether you work for a rival company or not, whether you work for Marvel or DC, like Len Wein and Denny O'Neil or Marv Wolfman, they're all going out to dinner together or hanging out, no matter who's signing the checks. Do you feel like anything was lost or changed when that stuff starts to happen?
I think things definitely change. I think you will see there's less of a sense of like, okay, everybody's exactly on the same page and everybody's pushing together. There's also a lot less of an echo chamber. There
Yes.
are, yeah, you don't get to see exactly the same artistic approaches and the same editorial points of view and the same writerly points of view once it's not just the same 3 or 6 or 12 people who all know each other really well. So you'll have people working on the East Coast doing their stuff. Then you'll have, you know, Jim Starlin and Alan Weiss and the whole West Coast contingent all kind of doing their thing. Eventually it stops being just the same monolithic group of white dudes who all grew up knowing each other. And that's really healthy. That's much better. Even there is fresh blood that comes in, even at the beginning of the 70s. You know, Stanley turns the keys to Spider-Man over to Jerry Conway, who is an actual teenager at that point.
Yeah.
He's 19 years old. Like, that makes it fresher. And once you start seeing, like, there are comics by people who don't read each other's comics necessarily, that's fine. That's fine. It's all coming from the same place. It's all going to the same place. They can do separate things. That's important.
When do you think the Marvel story becomes self-aware? And what do you think changes when that happens?
I mean, that's almost a Grant Morrison question. Like, when does the Marvel story become sentient? You know,
Are you going to give us a little Morrison accent?
I cannot do their
fine.
accent.
I can't either, so it's fine.
Yeah. There's a moment I actually talk about in the book in 1965 where all of a sudden there are 4 or 5 comics published the same month. They all have Kirby and Lee involved with them. It's an issue of X-Men, an issue of Avengers, and Journey into Mystery and Fantastic Four. And events in each of them are playing out in the others. And actually, also Daredevil right about then. But there's this moment where, like, you know, there's a kid who's trying to get somebody at Avengers Mansion on the phone because, you know, there are some Asgardian gods who are doing something shifty, and he can't raise them because they are lost at sea at then because of what was going on in Fantastic Four. And then he tries to get Daredevil's attention while Daredevil is swinging past the window, but he's on his way to catch the Submariner, which we saw in the previous month's issue. And it's all in the same place at the same time. And you don't need to read any one of the stories to get what's going on in the others. But when you do, you see how they all fit together. And one thing that's really interesting is that years later, a bunch of other stories go back to that particular moment. It is when the kooky quartet lineup of the Avengers comes together. Like when all of a sudden the Avengers, like everybody's quit the Avengers and all of a sudden it's Captain America and 3 ex-felons and terrorists. And that's the moment where it all feels like it's being the same thing. And it was functionally a crossover. It's Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver deciding in X-Men that they are leaving Magneto's team, they are striking out on their own. And the next week, Avengers comes out and they're like, oh, this is a thing we can do. I'm going to add, that's not the first Marvel crossover. The first multi-title Marvel crossover is 2 months after Fantastic Four #1. It does not involve superheroes. It happens in Linda Carter Student Nurse, Patsy and Heidi, Patsy Walker, Millie the Model, and Kathy the Teenage Tornado. That's a whole other thing.
I'm laughing because I read the chapter you did in the book, and it's amazing about that specific moment. Yeah. You know, it's funny, we're talking about, like, again, this kind of bubbling metatextual awareness that starts popping up in these books. You know, do you feel like that changes again as the core of creators who are, you know, putting their efforts into putting these books out every month? Do you feel like, how does that complicate things? You know, before, when, you know, it's 10 or 12 people, like, you can kind of maintain that kind of really deeply interconnected energy, which is, you know, the thing that differentiated Marvel Comics from its competitors. But how does that change? How hard is it to maintain that once that core creator starts to expand?
I mean, Marvel as a coherent story was never the idea from the beginning. It was an accident. It was maybe even a gimmick sometimes. It was a thing that kind of, you take a whole bunch of stones and you keep sticking stones on top of each other, and all of a sudden there's a mountain there. the idea of consciously treating it as this kind of immense story where every part connected to every other part, that's not a thing that really deliberately happened until much later. So to the extent that things were playing off each other, it was, like you say, because it was 10 or 12 people who kind of knew each other. And then after a while, they're just like a bunch of independent stories happening in the same kind of fictional place. And then people start getting the idea like, oh, yeah, we can do this cross connecting, cross talk. We can make it all pull together. And it's hard. Like you've made stories in these kind of environments too. It's incredibly tricky to make it all work.
Yeah.
But when it works, it's fantastically entertaining.
I mean, just touching on that, you said, like, I feel like the times I've been able to write Marvel Comics, to me, that's the main offering right now, is like, getting to play with that interconnectivity and getting to recontextualize moments and add depth and layering. I feel like, the meta text has become the text now, and in good hands, which hopefully sometimes have been mine, it's really fun. You were talking about like the fact that doing it all as one continuous story was never the plan. So let's pull back to the real world and talk about like why that was the interpretive framing that you chose for this book.
I mean, I'm a nerd. That is
Shocker.
Shocker. That's a thing that I've always liked about them. I like that it is a big story. I like that it's a story so big that even the people who are making the story don't know the whole story. Which is weird when you think about it, but it's also really beautiful that there is this fictional history along with the real world history that informs what's going on in the story at any point. That things that happened 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago are still there, and they come back. That's a gorgeous thing. And the fact that the people making the story have changed means that the story itself has changed, and its relationship to its environment has changed, and changed continuously. You can see the changes as they happen. I love that.
It's funny, you talking about that stream of thought brings up something I've been torn about of late. I think as comics and superheroes become more popular in the mainstream, there's been this like really easy shorthand of referring to them as modern mythology, right? And part of me is like, gets cranky about it. I'm like, mythology didn't come from the top down. It was like a way of understanding the world, stories that came from, grassroots or had like a larger kind of societal purpose. Do you think this constitutes a mythology?
I don't. I don't think it is quite mythology. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that, with very few exceptions, we know the specific names of everybody who made it, and that's incredibly important. Like, we are seeing a particular artist's hand, or a particular few artists' hands, in every line of this thing. We know who made it. We know the circumstances of its being made. And we're seeing all of it. We're not seeing what it's refined into. In some ways, you can say Peter Parker got bitten by a spider and his uncle died. Like, that's the mythology part. 100 years from now, people will likely still know something about kid who got bitten by a spider and his uncle died. The specifics of it, that's not mythology. It's not going to be for a while. But the part that like has become a story that the culture knows. The Spider-Man movies, the MCU Spider-Man, the first time Uncle Ben has been mentioned in the MCU, I found out recently, was in What If a few weeks ago.
Wow.
He's not mentioned. They don't tell the story of the Spider-Rat. They don't tell the story of the origin. Everybody knows it already. Why waste time? A story everyone knows? There's not a lot of those.
Yeah. It's funny because we're talking about whether it's a mythology or not. Do you feel like one of my core beliefs about this stuff is that, superheroes are inherently aspirational, and that's not like a big, revelation for me to say. That's pretty commonly held belief. Do you feel like the increasing popularity of this genre and these characters blunts that, increases the potential for aspirational messaging? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Huh. That is a super good question, he said, buying himself some time. But good questions are the ones that take a minute to think about. There's aspiration built into some of it, and that is a thing that is really meaningful. You see the people who are really, really interested in Captain America in particular. Like, Captain America is the inspirational guy. He is, at every turn, he is either what America is aspiring to be, or what America wants to aspire to be, or occasionally something that plays against that, like plays on the fact that, like, oh, you think you're aspiring to be this? Really think about that hard. I don't know that all superheroes are necessarily aspirational. I mean, there is something intrinsically creepy about Tony Stark. There is something intrinsically really creepy about Charles Xavier. A lot of the power of what's been happening in X-Men comics in the last 2 years is, wait a second, how do we feel exactly about this? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a complicated hint, spoiler, it's a complicated thing.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned that about Captain America, and to me, the best Captain America stories happen in the gap between the aspiration, the ideal, and the reality, right?
Yeah.
When Steve Rogers or Sam Wilson or whoever's been Captain America, Bucky Barnes, like, runs right up against that wall where the ideals meet the execution of the American dream or the American experiment. Like, those are the best stories, right?
Yeah.
It's what Steve Englehart, the Secret Empire stories from the 70s.
Oh yeah.
Where for those who don't know, there's a story in the 70s, quite infamously, that where Cap is unraveling a conspiracy that goes all the way up to the Oval Office, and it turns out that the leader of the conspiracy is largely meant to be Richard Nixon, who then shoots himself in the head in the Oval Office. So not subtle at all.
In a story published 3 months before Nixon resigned.
There's something to be said about, like, the almost clairvoyant kind of magical working that happens with these stories, right? How they're so closely adjacent to these important events in the real world. I think we can really chalk it up to robust imagining, but when they're that close, it's like, who knew what and how?
Yeah.
Speaking of real world events influencing these stories, I want to ask you, for those listeners out there who aren't necessarily well versed in the ups and downs of the comics business, there was a moment in the 1990s where Marvel was very near collapse. They declared bankruptcy, the first of several, I think, and it seems like they're going to go out of business. Do you feel like that affected the overall enterprise creatively? Like, we talked about the anxieties of the Cold War and other stuff. Here's something that's really close to home. Do you feel like it showed up in the comics at all?
Is this company going to fold, like that anxiety?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's interesting. There's not a lot of direct reference to it, obviously, but you see the direction of the line really, really changing about that point. It's right after the Heroes Reborn experiment, where the Avengers characters were basically leased out to the image creators for their studio, and that didn't go so well. But there's a lot of stripping away of the Marvel line at that point. The line had gotten really, really big. There were a ton of comics being published every month, and some of them were just clearly like, we need to build market share. Let's put out a thing. And then that stops, and there's a little bit of casting about for what are we going to do now? And one of the things that came out of that was Marvel Knights, like Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, who had been working for Event Comics, being given a subline and some characters like Black Panther and the Punisher and the Inhumans and a couple others, and like do stuff with this. And what they did was try to make it better, more concentrated, hired really interesting creators, made it look really visually beautiful. That was a big part of what they were doing, and focusing instead of cranking out product. And it worked. Like, those are beautiful looking books. They, like, one of them was that amazing priest run on Black Panther, and it worked. And within a couple of years, Joe Quesada's editor-in-chief of the company, and you can see that's where that comes from. But that's kind of coming out of that moment of near collapse.
Yeah, like, this may be our last shot, so
Yeah.
let's get really
Let's
crazy
nice.
with it. Yeah. You know, one of the things, Marvel Comics is now part of a huge corporate entity, and there's obviously a cinematic enterprise that is attached to the comics as well. Do you feel like there's still room for idiosyncrasy within the modern Marvel Comics era? And if so, where do you think it's thriving?
Where is the idiosyncrasy thriving in modern Marvel Comics? In weird little out of the way places. I mean, there's a chapter of the book that is half about Squirrel Girl, which I love to pieces, which doesn't look like anything else in mainstream comics, and yet it's a thing. It's happening. There was it happens in odd places. The Marvel's Voices anthologies have been featuring work by a lot of people who have not done mainstream superhero comic work before, and some of it looks a little different and reads a little differently, and that's great. Some of it is really fun. There's a lot of stylistic variety going on right now, especially on covers. Like, there's a bunch of variant covers, and that, interestingly, is a place where there's a ton of experimentation going on, and some of it looks really gorgeous. There's actually one other place. This just ended, but for about a year and a half, Marvel kind of sub-licensed some characters to IDW, who were publishing some kids comics. It was the Marvel Action line, and those don't really read or look like other mainstream comics titles either, and some of them are great. There's a couple of issues of Marvel Action Avengers that were written by Katie Cook. They are the lowest stakes Avengers stories you will ever read. They're about, like a new cookie recipe at a taco truck. One of them is this absolutely amazing story involving like Paste Pot Pete, who is now a substitute teacher, and Captain America like coming to the elementary school where he's a substitute teacher to teach kids about traffic safety, and Paste Pot Pete decides that this is his opportunity, and yeah, it's lovely.
There was a moment a couple of years ago where Marvel editorial passed the mantle of a bunch of their major characters to new heroes. So I'm talking about like Bruce Banner stops being the Hulk, and Amadeus Cho the Hulk, and Jane Foster becomes Thor. That moment, that was Marvel Now, right?
Yeah, thereabouts.
Yeah. So, can you talk about the risk that involved, the backlash, what it means to Marvel, again, as an ongoing, storytelling enterprise, to really kind of, for lack of a better word, diversify who some of their major characters' mantles get passed on to?
I think that's hugely important. I want to see so much more of it. I would have loved to see more of it stick than stock. There is always going to be a little bit of backlash for people who are like, well, this isn't what I was reading when I was a kid. Like, yeah, there's reasons for that. You're not a kid anymore. If I want to read stories about, Jay Garrick being the Flash, you're not going to replace him with this fancy new Barry Allen guy. these stories of these single characters, like, they can't go on forever. They can't. And passing them on to people who look more like the world looks makes it better stories. You don't have to get rid, like, nobody is getting rid of the old characters. You don't have to be afraid that the old characters are going away. Even, like, all of those characters were appearing just as many places as they ever did. It's just you were seeing some Hulks and some Spider-Man and some X-Men who were not the same 12 middle-aged white dudes anymore.
You know, I worked on the Miles Morales video game that came out last year. Was it last year? I don't remember anymore. What is time? But you know, one of the conversations I had with the people at Insomniac was like, you know, and it seems so basic, but like, what makes Miles Morales different than Peter Parker? You know, and the answers to those questions, you know, if you answer them right, you know, open up a gateway to a whole new audience, you know, to expanding the audience, which, you know, of course, sitting where we sit kind of makes sense, you know, but like, you know, again, just because Miles Morales exists doesn't mean Peter Parker stops existing, you know. And I feel like, and I've written essays about this, but like how I feel like Miles Morales makes Peter Parker a better character, because all of a sudden Peter Parker, the archetypal loner within the Marvel universe, like has somebody to be a mentor to, you know. It's like, you know, like, oh wait, you know, my screw ups and self-doubt and self-pity like aren't just about me anymore. If this kid who has the same powers as me mostly sees me modeling this behavior, I might be messing up his life too. So it encourages Peter Parker to do better. And I feel like that's a win across the board.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. Anyway, you know, I want you to talk about, you know, individual craft. You know, you've written comics before you started on this project. What is your sense of the actual craft of making comics? How did that enlighten you to surveying all of this massive work of publishing that Marvel's been doing for decades?
It was really interesting. It was fun to see particular creators developing and doing what they do over years, over decades. There are people who I'd always kind of taken for granted, and suddenly seeing a bunch of their work together. I think we talked about this a little bit, like Sal Buscema. Like, I had always thought of Sal Buscema as like the guy who could hit the deadlines, you know.
Yeah.
1970, he was drawing like 5 books a month. Like, just Kirby level speed. And he's a really, really basic storyteller, but he's an amazing storyteller. Like, he just absolutely puts the eye where it's supposed to go, moves it where it's supposed to go, gives you all the information that you need, gives you nothing superfluous. And when you get an inker together with him, somebody who can work with him artistically, somebody who can maybe impose a little of their own character on his stuff, Kyle Baker inks Sal Buscema, and all of a sudden, this is the most gorgeous thing you've ever seen.
Yeah. More texture, light, you know, and shadow and mood get communicated differently. It's, you know, I mean, I've been lucky enough to work with some artists where like I look at a page when the art comes in and like, that wasn't in the script. That's actually better. Thanks. Like, where do I send the flowers to? Okay, last question for me, then we'll move to Q&A. You know, we've been talking about the larger orbit of the Marvel Cinematic Universe around the comics. And, you know, What If has been airing in the last couple of weeks. And I think, you know, I've written about this, but like, I think What If as a concept works when there's a meta awareness in the audience, right? So, oh, we all know that Bucky died in World War II. What if he didn't? And, you know, do you think the Marvel Cinematic Universe can evolve to the same level of textual complexity as its comics counterpart, or does the nature of the form invalidate that possibility?
I don't know if it's even a fair comparison. I mean, what there is of the MCU, there can never be as much of it. There can never be anything on the scale of what the comics do. But also, what there is as movies, as TV, gets really, really deep attention, and it repays that kind of deep attention. Every time there's a new MCU movie or TV show, when WandaVision was coming out, you would look at people discussing it, and it would be pages and pages and pages of details of performance and details of just everything about the production design and everything that people were noticing and how it all connected to other parts of it. So it works in the same way. There's not as much of it, but it is all very centrally controlled, for lack of a better word, in a way that the comics are not. So
Yeah.
it's a real different thing, and it's a real special thing.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like part of what's so intriguing about your book and the journey, and a quick aside to everybody watching, like, I'm friends with Douglas, and I was very worried about this man while he was doing this. I'm like, dude,
I was
are you
on
gonna
good
be
shape.
okay?
Yeah.
But part of what's seductive about it is the volume and the density, right? Like, and the implicit complexity that awaits you. One of the things that I love that you wrote early on in the book was like, just jump in,
Yeah.
So, which leads me to Q&A, because we have a question about that very matter.
Please.
This question comes from Darius Shar. Could you give me a good starting point for someone who's new to Marvel Comics, e.g. like the Avengers? So, this is something that comes up in comics critic circles a lot. It's like, where do you start?
You start anywhere you like. And that's not a helpful answer in some ways. It is a really helpful answer in some ways. If you've got a good comic store or a good bookstore near you, look at anything that's got Avengers on the spine. It says Volume 1. Look at a couple of them. See if they grab you. See if they look interesting. It's okay if you don't understand all of it. You won't. That's okay. That is not a bug. That is a feature. You will not get everything that's going on, but you'll get enough to get what's happening. And the things that you don't understand, you can look those up. You can figure out where to go next. You don't have to read everything in order. You don't have to read anything in any particular order. You have, as a reader, you have a time machine. You have a dimension jumping machine. You can use them. You can go anywhere you like, backwards, forwards in the story. You don't have to go through it in the same order the characters do. It's fine. You'll figure it out. And figuring it out is so much fun. So much fun.
Steve, if you don't pipe down, I'm not going to ask your question. I'm kidding. I will. From Steve Flack, after reading everything, do you think there is a point where continuity is a hindrance? Both Marvel and DC have been on either side of that opinion repeatedly.
So continuity in the sense of like, we have to make everything cohere into one big story. It makes it harder for creators. If it is badly handled, it can make it harder for readers too. If it's just throwing dozens and dozens of like, oh, you must know this thing that if you don't know it, you won't understand this. That's bad writing. There's not a lot of that. There's not a lot of that particular kind of bad writing, I should say. There's lots of other kinds of bad writing too. But they are mostly designed so that you can pick them up and start. It used to be the same that like every comic book is somebody's first comic. That's not so much the case anymore, but it's still designed that way. So it's not a hindrance in that way. It can be a huge hindrance for creators who are trying to do a thing that hasn't been done before. What we see with DC, they've rebooted completely a couple times. They're just like, all right, so everything up to this point didn't really happen, or maybe a little of it did, but you don't need to worry about that anymore. You gain a lot of creative freedom from that. What you lose is the sense of history, of the bigger picture. And to me, that's a pretty significant loss. One of the things that I value about the Marvel story is that, it does have all this stuff, and some of it is kind of cruft, and some of it is hard, and some of it you really have to reinterpret if you're going to find it bearable at all. But some of it is beautiful and meaningful, and the fact that it is in the past is part of what makes it beautiful and meaningful.
This next question is from Joshua Glenn, and I love this question.
Hi, Josh.
Can you talk about some of the memes you've identified via your Tumblr account? And Joshua, I love this question because it uses memes in its original meaning, which is like a nugget of notion and a transportable idea. So for those who don't know, Douglas has been running a Tumblr called allofthemarvels.tumblr.com, where he's staking out and identifying and creating like this taxonomy of ideas that get replicated throughout Marvel Comics. So Douglas, take it away. What are some of the memes that your favorites?
Oh, I mean, I will say that Josh has actually featured some of them at his site, Highlowbrow. But yes, there's some things. There's actually one that has its own dedicated Tumblr, which is marvelba.tumblr.com, which is just anytime anybody says "ba," it's a good villain thing to say. It's a good J. Jonah Jameson thing to say. There are things like, "Where's Wakanda? Is Wakanda on the east coast of Africa? Is it on the west coast of Africa? Is it landlocked?"
Yeah.
Let's keep track of that. There's one that I loved, which was "Fortunately They Survived," which is, okay, so this is a panel of a bunch of people obviously getting killed with a bit of dialogue like, "Lucky thing they were able to bail out right before the plane exploded." Yeah, okay.
Yeah, as Claremont would write it, I got better.
I got that. Yeah, I think there's actually a bit in one of the New Mutant special that Claremont wrote where Magic is clearly just like cutting some dude in half, and the caption is like, "Wow, she almost really badly injured that person. Yeah, I better be careful."
Another question from Joshua. Do you think there are certain eras of Marvel when, generally speaking, the art was better than the other eras, and vice versa? Are there certain eras of Marvel when you struggle to enjoy the artwork, generally speaking?
Huh. There are periods. There's almost always some kind of interesting artistic thing going on somewhere. In the 60s, you've got the All-Stars. There's just about always something beautiful, like any Ditko comic, any Kirby comic. And there's multiples of those every month. There's plenty to look at. In the 70s, where the interesting artwork is, bounces around. Because artists were changing gigs a lot in those days, but you'll find like a living mummy story and supernatural thrillers that's suddenly really beautiful. There'll be a Man-Thing story that's gorgeous. For most of that decade, you've got Gene Colan and Tom Palmer working together on Tomb of Dracula, and it's just exquisite. You've got Billy Graham drawing Black Panther stories, which are just, when he's cutting loose, he's absolutely spectacular. In the 80s, you start seeing a bunch of really, really distinctive stylists. That is, that's John Byrne and it's Frank Miller and it's Walt Simonson.
Sienkiewicz.
Sienkiewicz, yes, thank you. Yes, Sienkiewicz all over. Sienkiewicz, like whatever he touches turns to gold. To this day, I just absolutely love him. And just over time, there are always different artists, and sometimes they are these slick and popular artists. Pepe Larraz, working right now, his stuff looks very house styly. It looks very slick. It looks almost like, okay, what kind of reference is he using here? Because he's got to be using. But he's so good at the psychological dimension of every single panel. Like every panel he draws, he's thought about like what effect is every little detail of this going to have on the reader, and it's gorgeous. It's beautiful. So.
To that point, like you think about like Steranko on Shield, right? Like who was expecting him to show up there, right? Like, like this is a spy book and there's all this drug and, like psychedelic imagery. Like it seems like the weirdest place for it, but like now it's become like emblematic of that character, it's really wild.
To this day, like if somebody does a spy story at Marvel, they're probably going to throw in a couple of Steranko homages.
Yeah. And then you had that Nick Fury book that Aiko drew a couple of years ago, where it was like, oh, it's just the whole series is like going to be like tripping balls, basically.
Yeah.
Our next question, and maybe last, depending, from Sean Howe. Terrific conversation. Thank you, Sean. Terrific book to you. I'd love to hear about the reading process, how you paced yourself, areas that felt difficult to get through, what it was like to arrive at last at the edge of the world.
The reading process, it was long. It was longer than I thought it was going to be, because at first I was like, oh yeah, okay, on a solid 8-hour day, I can do 100 issues.
Oof, dude, are you kidding
Uh,
me?
yeah. There were some of those days. There were also days where I just hit a wall. I read wherever I could. I read sitting on the couch. I read, had a treadmill, a walking desk. I read on public transportation, on my phone. I read whenever I could get a spare minute. I had a little stack of stuff next to, like, I just have to do it all. I grazed. I didn't read things in order. I jumped around to whatever I felt like reading on any given day, but as I was getting toward the end, I realized that there were some spots I had been avoiding, and I was just going to have to knuckle down and do them. I think the ultimate manifestation of that was when I locked myself into an apartment for, I believe, 11 days to read all of The Punisher.
You did that in New York, right?
I did that in New York, yeah, because
I remember when you did that. Yeah, I was
yeah,
like,
I knew that I wasn't going to have friends around. I wasn't going to have reasons like, oh, I can go out and get out of the house, see some friends. It was like, no, I am taking my punishment. I am.
literally.
Yeah.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
On that note, you talk about reading stuff on the phone, iPad, or whatever. Like, I've always wondered what a dude like you thinks about, like, when comics get recolored and represented out of their original, production processes. Like, I don't always feel like I have a great eye for that stuff, but there's sometimes where I'm like, oh my God, this color is garish. This is not like, can you talk about like the work of making sure these stories get represented throughout the decades and how that changes the affect, if at all?
Yeah, it's really odd. I mean, reading a comic panel by panel on your phone is not the same thing as holding the original artifact in your hands and seeing it with the advertising, seeing it with letter columns, seeing it with all the extra material, feeling the newsprint that it's printed on. It's not the same, but it's something. It's something. You get the gist of it. It's odd to see how some things, when they get reproduced to try to look contemporary, and that very rarely works. There's actually a thing that I believe at least one person in our audience worked on, which was in the mid 80s, Doctor Strange Classics, which was a bunch of 60s Ditko stories that were not just recolored, they were painted in watercolor. And it was very much like, we are taking a different approach to coloring this. We are deliberately taking a different approach to coloring this, and here's what it's going to look like. Ed Piskor actually did something kind of similar when he did the X-Men Grand Design, where he reprinted 3 old issues of X-Men from 3 different periods and recolored them himself to be in his own visual idiom. So it is X-Men #1 and Giant Size #1, and I think the Jim Lee #1, all Ed Piskor style. Like, okay, that is a recasting, that is a reframing. It's not the same thing. It's not a bad thing. It's a real interesting thing. There are things like, there's one of those Doctor Strange stories that I actually was like, okay, let's see how the coloring changed. And I looked up how it was colored when it was originally printed, and how it was colored when it was reprinted in Marvel Tales and Strange Tales a few years down the line, and how it was reprinted when it was in Marvel Masterworks, and how it was recolored when it was the version that's on Marvel Unlimited. And some of them are just like completely different palettes. Like, it's a different thing. Interesting. Sort of the same experience, not quite.
And as you're talking, like, I'm thinking about the classic X-Men title, edited by our very own Annie Nocenti, where those stories from the 70s and even sometimes even earlier get reprinted for a more modern audience in the 80s. And then you have these backup stories which expound, they tell us some of the kind of interstitial moments that happen. So, it's representing and recontextualizing like twice, 3 times over, which again is I think one of the attractive things about the Marvel story, right? Like, there's that infamous Stan Lee quote about giving the readers the illusion of change, but sometimes that mandate of repetition lets you kind of reimagine these moments that the audience may have seen already for new times. So I'm going to end on that note. I want to thank Douglas for gracing us with all his wisdom and kindness and knowledge.
Thank you so much, Evan. I could not have asked for a better person to talk to you about this. I'm so grateful.
And I'm going to come and say thank you so much to you both as well. It was so fun to be a fly on the wall in the room where you guys are talking about all of this. And
read
I'm so
Evan's
grateful for
comics.
it.
Read Evan's
read
comics.
Evan's comics. Read Douglas's book. The links are in the chat. You can find them at Greenlight Bookstore and anywhere comics are sold. So thank you guys for a great night. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.